Welcome at a new appointment with European Affairs. Today we are with a professor, Borys Babyn, doctor in international law and senior scientist advisor of Legislation Institute of the Ukrainian Parliament. Welcome at the European Affairs appointment. Professor, we ask your time just to better understand what is coming in Ukrainian in the Crimea area. The situation in the Crimean territories is always critical, and in the recent months, however, another problem is added: the chronic lack of water. How does this problem arise?
Well, this problem have two main grounds, as before the illegal occupation of Crimea, the water for the Crimean industry, like chemical industry, agricultural industry, and military structures were supplied by Ukrainian mainland from the Dnieper River by the northern Crimea channel that given more than 85% of all water for the Crimean economy. But when Russian Federation occupied Crimea, there was no any possibility to make any water supply for Crimea, and the channel was stopped. And after this, Crimean economy have problems with water. But anyway, Crimean residents have no problems with drinking water or working of water for the personal purposes, as such sources are enough in Crimea. But huge enterprises like huge chemical plants in Krasnoperikopsk, in Armyansk, and huge naval base of Russia in Sevastopol, also as big in agricultural enterprises in the central Crimea, they need a lot of water. That's why Russian Federation, from the start of its illegal occupation, declared that they will search some tools to make alternative sources of the water for industrial purposes in Crimea. But all such efforts were fake, as there are no any real practical possibility to supply water from the Russian territory, from Caucasus. And there are no good technologies in Russia to make water from the maritime water of Black or Azov seas. And also there are not a lot of water in the Crimea, including the artesian waters. But Russian Federation from 2014 started illegally to excavate in mass artesian water of Crimea. And during 5 years, Russia reduced this unique artesian grounds and lenses of water under Crimean territory, and such waters now are salty after 5 years of absolutely illegal and also not scientific, not grounded excavating of such water. I may remind you that in Ukrainian time and even in Soviet time before 1991, the excavation of such artesian waters was banned directly. And even it was it was criminal responsibility for those who excavated illegally. And artesian waters of Crimea were used only for medical purposes and maybe in some unique places where there was no any other alternative. But in common, Crimean economy used water from the Dnieper River, from the northern Crimea channel. But now they excavated such waters and they have red line for them, as they understand that there are no more water down the Crimean territory. And from other time, we have now the second dry year, as Crimean climate is Mediterranean, and maybe you know what are the Mediterranean climate, and not a lot of rains and snows, and sometimes we have climatic cycles. And after the occupation, 3 or 4 first years of illegal occupation were during so-called wet part of the climatic cycle, and there was quite a lot of rains and snows in winter in Crimea, and some water bases that collect the water from the Crimean mountains were full, and it allowed the Russian Federation to use such water for their purposes. But we have second dry year of the climatic cycle this year, and for example, this winter was without snow in Crimea mountains and in Crimean steppe, and that is a dry, very dry spring of this year. It called empty of all the water lakes and rivers in Crimea. That's why Russian authorities in Crimea can't excavate water for their purposes from the natural sources. That's why they activate their efforts to get some water from the Ukrainian mainland, to get water from northern Crimean Channel, including the military activity.
So this issue, that is a very important issue, making start a debate on the responsibility of this lake. What is your point of view?
Well, regarding the Geneva law, all responsibility for humanitarian purposes are covered by the responsibility of the occupying power, and the occupying power is the Russian Federation for Crimea. That's why Russia has the exclusive responsibility for any issue that may be connected with Crimean industries and Crimean humanitarian needs. But anyway, local sources of Crimean waters are enough for the Crimean population, and the northern Crimean Channel has its purpose not to give the water to the population, but to give the water to the industry and to the military sector. That's why Ukraine have no any obligation to supply any water to Crimea. From other time, local hydrotechnic nets in Crimea are old, and during last 5 years, Russia did not repair it. Russia did not invest any capex to these systems, and even regarding to the data that was proclaimed by the Russian powers in Crimea, they lost in such nets more than 50% of local water. That's why we say that there is no any obligation of Ukraine to help the occupying power, to help Russian Federation to solve the problem of their impossibility to organize the simplest life in the Crimean territory, the simplest real duties of population, like canalization, like water, etc. That's why Ukraine have no any responsibility for such situation. Another responsibility is the occupying power responsibility.
So talking about another problem, many violations of human rights have been reported. What is the situation in the Crimea territories?
Well, the violation of human rights in Crimea may be divided on some groups. One group of violations are connected with the racial discrimination and violations the right of indigenous Crimean Tatar people that resides in Crimea. It is its historical native land. Also as racial discrimination against the ethnic or linguistic Ukrainians in Crimea. Those are issues connected us with collective, so with individual rights of such population, and they reflect all the issues of life of Crimean Tatars in Ukraine or Ukrainians. So for issues of work, social activities, legal issues, administrative services, etc. It's the first group. The second group is discrimination of all population of Crimea against the colonizing Russian citizens that come to Crimea not in compliance with Geneva law. As we know that some 100,000 of Russian citizens are already resides illegally in Crimea, and they are in preferences against local population in eyes of Russian authorities, as they are more loyal, of course, and as they are real Russians, and that's why Russia discriminates Ukrainian citizens and own citizens in Crimea directly. Also, we may point that some group of violation of human rights in Crimea are connected with illegal militarization of Crimea, and it is connected with violations of violation by Russia of its humanitarian obligation. For example, Russia forcibly takes the Crimean residents to own army, and it is forbidden by Geneva law. Also, Russia forcibly cover Crimea by its own legislation against the Geneva law, and this legislation is not in compliance with Ukrainian. For example, Russia have very sharp and hard legislation in area of so-called extremism and in area of ban of peaceful assemblies and also as civil associations. That's why civil associations now in Crimea are discriminated, and peaceful assembly, it's impossible to hold peaceful assembly in Crimea. Also, a lot of persons are punished by the criminal and administrative responsibility for so-called extremism, and such punishment covers the issues of social network publication, of some even eye-to-eye talks on kitchens, etc. And all of these issues are criminalized by Russia, and hundreds of Crimean residents are punished by it by prison. That's why we may point that there are a lot of political prisoners in Crimea and a lot of victims of discrimination in Crimea that they are in prisons, in non-freedom places, or as in Crimea, so in other territories, in Russian Federation, in Siberia, in north of Russia, etc.
So, in your opinion, what do you expect from the international community to help Ukrainian government to solve this crisis?
For this day, we have a direct obligation for any country that has its grounds in the common international law and treaty international law not to recognize the attempt of annexation of Crimea. It is obligation of all civilized nations of the world, of all United Nations member states. So any country, as their friends or enemies or good friends or something else for Russia or for Ukraine, they have direct obligation not to recognize the attempt of annexation. Crimea is Ukrainian territory, and any activity of any other state in area of diplomacy, international organization, treaties, migration, legal enforcement activities, legal cooperation, scientific cooperation, cultural, educational cooperation, of transport, of business, of investments, they must reflect the Crimea in all official documents, in all media publications, in all official statements, and in all government and sub-government activities as Ukrainian territory. It's one issue and it is obligation. It can be discussed even. The other issue is issue of possibly activities that may be done by anybody who want to help Ukraine and help Crimean residents. And those are sanction policy issues, and we may point that sanctions against the Russian Federation are enforced and they are active. For example, sanctions of European Union and other civilized nations established by 2014 now have a real result, as the level of international crimes and crimes against humanity in Crimea is high but not highest. And the most ugly things that we are afraid for not happened. Genocide didn't start, but Russia prepared for it. Mass discrimination and mass deportation of Crimean Tatar population did not start yet, but Russia prepared for it. And mass enforced disappearances that started in 2014, they were reduced later as Russian Federation are afraid of sanctions against such enforced disappearances in Crimea. That's why sanctions are the vital issue, not only for theoretical grounds of international law, but for the human rights of any Crimean residents in Crimea, as they are the only guarantee for their life and prosperity. That's why any country who recognize the human rights, who recognize the collective rights, who recognize the duty to fight with genocide and discrimination and other international crimes, must enforce sanctions against Russian Federation connected with Crimea, must supervise the sanctions already adopted, control the implementation in real life, in real economic and cultural and social relations, and make reports in those issues to own population, to human defenders, to international organizations.